Thanks.
In Providence, they're everywhere.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a work session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Tuesday, July 12th, 2022. The time is 7:05. I will do roll call. Susan Axelrod is absent. Joe Murphy? Here. Paul Jordan?
Here.
Peter DiStefano is absent. Robin Pothier?
Here.
And Maria Mack is here. Our first agenda item is missing middle multi-household land development regulations, discussion workshop. Jamie, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. With regards to the workshop under item B, we have the missing middle. We did distribute with the agenda the regulations on the mansion homes, townhouses that was prepared by Horsley Witten and Union Studios. You've seen this a few times. We had Union Studios and Horsley Witten here a little over a month ago to go over some of those housing types and styles and how you look at density and how you control the architecture of those. So I think what I'd like to participate in tonight is a general discussion on yes, no, maybe, not in my lifetime, reaction to those regulations and those housing types so that we can try and get some direction on next steps. Is the regulation, is it formatted in a good framework? Does it need more work? Are there concerns about the architecture, bulk, density? I know we've had some discussion that I like, and feel free to correct me if my interpretation of some of the discussion is incorrect, but I think as it relates to one parcel, one potential unit on a parcel, whether it be one little 4-unit townhouse or one estate mansion homes, you seem somewhat comfortable with that style, architecture, or what you've seen. Some of your biggest concerns, if someone had an acre and tried to put 4 mansion homes or squeeze 6 duplexes in, and how those duplexes would look from a density standpoint, an architectural standpoint, and then how they fit with the neighborhood that is potentially well established for 50 plus years. So,
I have a list.
Okay.
Thank you, Jamie, for that introduction. I think that as we move along with looking at all the tools that we need for addressing the affordable housing issues before us, I always go back to the need to look at sort of big picture and all of the, not only the tools, but the impacts and what we might see as outcomes. And, one of the things that the board has mentioned over the last few work sessions is issues that we are having with our current regulations, whereby we have allowed an increased density in some projects, but it has not necessarily, it hasn't led to affordable housing. Regulatory issues whereby the board feels that we did not have sufficient ability or authority in some cases to create a better design. I think everyone knows what I'm referring to. So it seems to me that we need to address those issues. We need to be thinking about, as we're always talking about, a good fit, particularly with infill. I believe that the capacity is a major issue, not just in terms of, yes, let's just add density where we have sewer and water, but actual capacity, whether it's with regard to traffic and circulation or water as far as the amount of water. I mean, we have an issue with water this time of year. design standards are important, and I believe that the design standards have to come early on with regard to architecture. And I don't think that we can look at any of these things without a conversation about our landscaping regulations, which I think were done in the 1970s. I feel that they're largely ineffective at this point in time. We have been talking for several years about redoing them. I'm willing to work on this, but I think that's part and parcel of this whole effort. I think that, as Jamie referred to, we need to be aware of cumulative impact. So to me, we also need to look at sort of, again, going back to the big picture view, at what the build-out is and what I think we need to be looking at maps, too, and we need to be thinking about where do we have land, what the impact to capacity would be, particularly with regard to the fact that, as we all know, we have inclusionary zoning, so anything over 5 lots is subject to that. So we need to figure out what impact that has. And I know some of that might be a little bit of a guess, because you don't know if somebody's going to do 5 lots or 4 lots or more. But you can get an idea. I think we need to tie in stormwater management to all of this, because you increase the density and you start to build some of these large scale buildings, you need to have even more tools at your disposal with regard to stormwater, which is something that we've all been struggling with. So, the Smart Growth America has just come up with Dangerous by Design, which relates to pedestrian, bike, traffic safety. I know that there has been discussion at the town council level about complete streets, and I think we need to take all of those things into consideration when we are considering such whole-scale changes to our zoning ordinance. And what we have before us, I'm a little concerned that although the word village is in there, I haven't seen a lot in those draft regulations that makes me believe this is a village scale. And as you know, the village model is something that we have worked to continue with for many years. So those are my comments. Abbreviated. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you've said. I was thinking about landscape in South Kingstown and what it is about South Kingstown that we like, and it's the stone walls and the sort of, the scruffy vegetation that you see down at the beach. And so if you clear a couple of acres down in Green Hill, I was going to say Matunic, but I don't want to pick on anybody, and you put in this nicely landscaped area, it's not what was there before. And I understand a lot of it might have been invasives, but sort of, mimicking what's there, planting, if it's down at the beach, the sort of native species that you would see at the beach, and planting them, densely enough that it doesn't look like a landscaped area like you'd find at a golf course. It looks like a natural area. I think that's part of the draw of this entire, south shore of Rhode Island, is that look. And so we see these developments come in and we put in some landscaping. I always, rail against the row of arborvitae to block the view of the street or something. So landscape, I think, is important. The architecture, it's occurred to me that what I think some recent projects that have sort of not excited the board, they're designs that were picked out of a catalog, as though you were building another Levittown, or, I think a builder comes in and he says, okay, here's this catalog of these standard designs that I can build anywhere in the country, and I know exactly what it's going to cost me to build them. But the idea of just walking around a neighborhood and looking at what's there and finding some designs that they don't have to match exactly, but in terms of the scale, the massing, the materials, there should be some effort to kind of say, okay, I want to try and blend in with this existing neighborhood. I've got this 2-acre lot that's been sitting here forever, in the middle of town, and now I'm going to build something on it. Let me do what I can to make it look like it's been here a while. And I think that means, we see these designs where what you see is a garage with some living space attached to it instead of a home with a garage attached to it. And I think it just offends everybody's eye. Looking at these designs in the Horsley Witten package, they're all very nice. I think they would fit in well here. The other thing that, Jamie, you mentioned, I can't remember if it was the last work session or the one before, was looking at zoning and setbacks. That current zoning doesn't let you build what's there next door. You've got to push the house way back when the one that's there was built in a different time, and it's got a much shorter setback. It's closer to the street with a front porch or something. It's more a part of the streetscape. And it got me thinking there's another project in town, right here in town, I think on Columbia Street, where somebody's looking at subdividing a large lot. And when you look at what's proposed versus the scale of what's around it, it fits. So I think those setback rules, the architecture, the landscaping, I think there's a lot that we could do with developers to just say, could you just look at what's there before you come in and plop these designs down and put in this carefully manicured landscape that would look fine in front of a shopping center on Long Island, but it doesn't work in South Kingstown. There's a new proposal in Middletown, where it's like this cute little village surrounded by acres of parking. And, it's like so many things that we see coming in. It just looks like it was dropped from outer space. I've got this thing that kind of looks nice, and I'm just going to drop it here on this lot and make it fit. And it doesn't really work. So that's what I've been thinking. I've been talking to Maria about this, sort of thinking, what is it about landscaping and architecture? We could come up with some standard designs, materials, but I think if somebody just took the opportunity to walk around a neighborhood, around the vacant lot that they want to develop, and said, what can I do that would fit here, that would look like it's going to be new, but it might, in a couple of years, look like it's actually been here for a while. And I'm not sure how you get there from here, but that's what I've been thinking about.
I think I mentioned this last time. I don't really want to lose the thought, but one of the things that I've been thinking about over the last few meetings as things are presented to us is we're seeing a lot more of the comprehensive permit and how the incentives fit in to the surrounding area. So in some cases, the additional incentive density bonus that they get, that the developer gets, can fit in well. And then in other cases, if it's already beyond the carrying capacity, those incentives cause a lot of difficulties. And we're supposed to be balancing the need for affordable housing with the impacts to the community. And I'm not sure that our regulations, I think we feel at a disadvantage when we're having those impacts, but maybe the incentive is no greater than another project that we approved. So in a case like maybe Matunic, where we had a lot of drainage issues, maybe those incentives, it's difficult, and maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should have something in our regulations that when we're beyond the carrying capacity, that we shouldn't allow those incentives. And the other example of a project we had, we have a higher density, but we have this sprawl that came out to the main road, and then those higher densities didn't fit in with the community. So, if they're higher densities and they're further back and they're kind of isolated, I think that can fit in pretty well. But then when you allow those densities to sprawl into an existing neighborhood and they don't fit into that neighborhood, I don't think that that was in our best interest. So I think we missed that. Or at least I felt like I missed that, looking at those reviews of the impact to the road, not the neighborhood behind it.
Robin, thoughts?
I think what stands out to me as a concern is if our goal is really to provide that LMI unit, then this 10% of every development that comes in is never going to get us there. So you put new houses in and 10% meets the quota, but it never catches us up with what we need to do. So along with these incentives should be, why can't we say 50% of the development needs to be LMI? Like, get us there or don't bother. I also think that I really have a hard time imagining how much R10 and R20 are still available for these big units. And there's reference to an RM zone. I wasn't sure what that is. Maybe I've got it wrong. It's R something.
Multifamily. Residential multifamily.
Okay.
Something
that
we
is
don't have a lot
zoning.
of.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Residential multifamily, RM, okay. And so, I don't think what the town wants to do is just invite a whole lot of more people. We want to make our community match the needs of lower income people without just making this a high-density neighborhood. So I think that we really need to demand more LMI in everything we're approving. And aren't these three types of multifamily already allowed in all our zones? Like you referred, Jamie, to putting one on a 1 acre, but wouldn't that be R40? And we wouldn't be able to put one of these there?
So with regards to the structure of the zoning, you're correct in some aspects as it relates to R10, R20, and R30 on what you can do. But with regards to your two takeaways, Robin, the 50% requirement, if state law doesn't align with a higher than 30%, no matter what you write in your regulations, they'll just, you can't go above what the my advice is, I said, you can do anything. But if you go above what a developer can utilize as a comprehensive permit process, where they're allowed to deviate from your zoning code, they're not going to take that permitting track and follow a more stringent zoning code. So, for example, if you wrote a regulation that said, in essence, I will almost give you a permit if you do meet our architectural standards, but do 50% of your units as LMI. The developer may choose to do that, or they may just choose to do a comprehensive permit where they can deviate from your architectural standards, deviate from your density, and only have to submit 30% LMI. So there's a fine balance between finding almost a clear, determinable permitting path that doesn't butt heads with pushing them down an avenue of just doing a comprehensive permit. So if you stay in that realm of 25 to 30%, but offer them some certainty in the development process, some developers will choose to just go through your permitting process if there's certainty in an outcome, versus using the comprehensive permit, throwing your regulations, we'll call it, out the window, and then potentially butting heads with the commission and having months and months of deliberations and decisions. So it drags out for a year or 2 or 3 during your 3-step process. So again, it's a balance, but I don't see how you can mandate 40, 50% from a developer without them pushing back and just doing the comprehensive permit. But I think if you had a path in the 30 percentile range, but it was a path to a permit, I don't want to use the term expedited, but I will. I gave them a clear path to a permit that wasn't riddled with delays and inconsistencies and back and forth. And I think listening to Maria, Joe, and Paul tonight, and again, I'll defer to council on this, and it may take some more research, is that some of the things you're talking about and some of the concerns you have is the I don't want to say the quality, but the quality of the applicant and the product they're bringing to you. And Joe, you know, the reference of Levittown, or kind of that one-size-fits-all house. And whether I'm in an R40, I'm building it, and whether I'm in an R10, I'm building it. And say it's a raised ranch, I'm just building that model regardless of the neighborhood I'm putting it in. So one of the thoughts we've had, and we have kicked it around internally, and I've discussed it with a few planning board members, is if there can be a preliminary application process, like before they even come into you, that you can potentially require it as mandatory, where the first step is the plan they show you is prepared and stamped by a landscape architect and an architect registered in the state of Rhode Island. So that from day one, the discussion starts with neighborhood consistency, architectural style, and landscaping associated with this development. And we've all seen the pretty pictures of how it can be done. You're just not seeing those types of results. So, you know, Don Powers, Jeremy Lake, myself, good planners, good architects, we can put a million pictures on the photo, on the board, and photos of them. But the key is how do we work with council and deliver the product, right? Because I mean, there was just a product done on Nantucket. It's, I want to say it's Plum Development or Plum Estates, where I think it's 20 homes. And each home is like a jigsaw puzzle piece, where all 20 homes had to be built by the same developer, literally intricately interwoven with the house next door to it, because the outdoor space and the indoor space had a direct relationship to the house next to it, which then reflected on the house next to that, and so on and so on and so on. So they were homes with garages, homes with outbuildings. They weren't garages with living space. So Paul, I may use that again, but I get your point. But it's creating this regulatory path, Robin, and clearly identifying it. With regards to your question on what land is available in R20 and R10, I think with regards to infill and your price fluctuations in town, you can't just look at vacant land in R10 and R20, that you almost have to make the assumption that any potential housing lot in your R10 and R20 is potentially developable for infill. Because the price of raw land is escalating, is almost outpacing the price of the unit that sits on the land. So you will have developers who start buying 2 and 3 house lots that have, you know, and you've seen a little bit of this, where someone's buying the house lot that happens to have 30,000 square feet with one house on it that's in an R10 zone. Now, what developers are doing now is making an additional lot in the back and getting 2 housing lots out of it. What you haven't seen is the tear down of that house and the developer doing 3 single-family homes with 3 lots on that 10,000. And you know, realtors and developers are looking. I can tell you they're actively looking for that today because of the price points, because it's almost $250,000 for a house lot in town. Right. So if you can pick up a house for 5 that happens to have 30,000 square feet, you're already even with a tear down in the sale of the lots, because you're creating your own inventory. So we could tell you how many vacant lots are in the R10 and R20, but I think we'd be doing something short-sighted, because the lots to the left and right of it are also going to be available as your housing stock ages, and you have some well cared for properties and some not so well cared for properties.
But looking at the overall zoning and looking at maps and seeing where the RM or the R10, R20 districts are, that would be useful for us as a...
And you have some Developments probably from 1970 and 1980 that are well established in your R10 and R20s, the likelihood that those are going to experience tear downs and rebuilds is less than looking at some of your more historic housing stock areas in town where that house may have been built in 1920, 1930. It costs more to renovate it than to tear it down and build 3 of the same on the property.
So a couple things, and I think I've asked this before about the multifamily residential, the fact that there isn't much in town that's zoned for it, and the possibility of looking at are there places we could potentially increase that, have more opportunity for that sort of housing. The other thing that I think about, I mean, every time we talk about LMI, and I apologize for not knowing the language better and whether or not it's a town rule or a state rule, but this idea that the low to moderate income units need to kind of match or be very similar in size to the market rate units. That's state.
State law.
Equity issue.
It just seems like, you could, if you started thinking about the number of bedrooms, that you could build smaller LMI units, smaller bedrooms, a smaller house, and if you think about what a regular sort of organically grown neighborhood looks like, there are small houses, there are very large houses, there's a mix. And when you come in and say, well, they've all got to be kind of this, you're getting back to that kind of cookie cutter neighborhood that I think we want to avoid.
And Paul, to your point, I think that's where thinking outside the box, being a little creative, and to Robin's point, how do you get a developer to maybe do a little bit more? If the state law is 30%, but every house has to be like the other, so if you're building 2,200 square foot houses, your 2,200 square foot house that's going to sell for $700,000 to $800,000 in town, the one next to it that's an LMI has to be plus or minus 2,200 square feet. But I don't think there's anything in the law that would allow you to do an incentive regulation that allowed the developer to do a 2,200 square foot market rate house in a 1,600 square foot LMI.
So you're saying that's not possible? Or
I think that's potentially possible because you're not doing it under the guidance of the law. You're creating your own zoning category and doing your density bonus based on providing that additional LMI unit. And again, that's for Mike and Amy and others to get creative on that.
And I know Peter said more than once that just because it's smaller doesn't mean that it's less expensive to build. But I mean, think about, and I don't know if the market rate has granite countertops, does the LMI unit have?
No, they don't have to.
I mean, I just think if there's a way to do that, or to have that, and I think we've seen it here. There was one project, I think it was a comp permit, where we had some duplexes. But just more of that sort of, can you mix a variety of housing sizes in and get more bedrooms and more LMI families into a neighborhood?
You can't under the law, under the guidance of a comprehensive permit, but I'm not sure if there's any restrictions if you did an incentive housing zone in your R10 or R20.
We could create.
I mean, you could structure this.
Yes, an overlay or some kind of incentive.
Because in some aspects, the developer may want to do the mix, but in order to get the return on his investment to carry the LMI unit, he has to build that big house or market rate, and then he's forced to do the LMI at market rate too.
And they would actually prefer to have a lesser degree of expense for the LMI units, and so
and what Peter
smaller units.
What Peter has said, whether it's an LMI unit or a regular unit, if it's on-site well, it's still $10,000 for the well, whether it's LMI or market rate. Still requires a septic system. It's no less expensive for the market rate versus the LMI. You still have 2 bathrooms. You still have not 2 kitchens, but a kitchen. They both potentially have basements. Right. You still have to heat to 2,200 square feet. One may have a slightly lesser boiler, but in most instances, developers just stick with the same. So they need to absorb that cost somewhere. It may be an opportunity to look at a model where you allow, a 20% or some number that the LMIs do not have to be a 1-for-1.
And especially if they're in town, with town
Like
water
next.
and sewer, the utilities are here. And, it may be a population that is going to need to be on a bus line or be able to walk to the grocery store. Maybe they don't have 2 or 3 cars in the household. If you're, I don't know, it just seems like something to pursue.
Exactly. And then the other,
Maria, can I just quickly ask?
yeah.
How do the 4 members feel about, at some point in the process, mandating from a regulatory standpoint that anything above a single-family house requires signed plans by a landscape architect and a registered architect?
I love it.
Yeah, Paul said it very well. If you look what's surrounding the area and design it so that it fits in well, you can have something that's a Victorian house that looks like a Victorian house that has several apartments in it. But they need to fit in with the surrounding area. And you also have to be cognizant of what the impact of, are you going to have 8 cars per building? Do you have the capacity? That seems to be something that is not always well thought out in some of the ideas that come forward from the affordable housing perspective.
My feeling about it is that
Look at all those things.
is that the demand is here. People want to be here. So if we're making it a little bit more difficult for the builder, the demand is still there. And if we can get some of what we want, and it means that they get some of what they want, but
Yes,
they're going to build here regardless.
exactly.
So
You're right. They want to be here, and we should be able to not only have design standards that are appropriate for the community, but we also need the tools so that we as a board are not put in the position that we have been in so often. Comprehensive permits aside, but Jamie's idea of creating some kind of incentive zone where we come up with the standards and they will build it if it's there. But again, it's got to fit in. We've got to look at all of the things that planners look at. Stormwater, circulation, all those things, landscaping.
My only concern about that, and I think Jamie said it a little while ago, and it rung to me, was that one of the issues that we have in South Kingstown is that we have this model of a single-family house that we stick on all different size lots. So even the one that we saw behind the police station, it was a house that could go on a 20,000 square foot lot, a 10,000 square foot lot, a 30,000 square foot lot, and what the developer did was take that house and just put them a lot closer. That's
Right.
basically what happened, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
there's a lot of good as far as the landscape architecture for anything other than a single-family house. But we also want to be careful that we're not providing an incentive to additional types of housing. So I'm good with the concept, but I would like to see a balance with some other type of incentive for the other types of house.
Yeah.
So it would have to be balanced, not just provide
And
a incentive.
and we've talked about improving duplexes, but we never have gotten beyond that initial statement. So I think that's also should be part of the conversation.
What goes hand in hand, and we have, without looking at the numbers, $30,000 to $35,000 left in the Horsley-Witten study. So there's funds available to potentially develop architectural standards and basically design guidelines for things above duplexes. And we can categorize those. And to Joe's point, just like house designers or commercial designers, not everyone has the same talent. Not everyone has the same aesthetic eye that you may be seeing versus what they're seeing. So just to require a landscape architect and architect signatures, you have to couple that with guidance. So without the guidance, you still could have a residential registered architect who does a modern farmhouse slash split level. So again, your guidance is, and your point in these multifamily housing or multi-lot developments, that there's a mix, no different than you would see on High Street, that maybe there isn't 26 different types of houses, but there's 6, 7, or 8. One's got a farmer's porch on it, one doesn't. And I think someone mentioned Levittown. Levittown had different models, but also Levittown evolved over time. Some houses at Levittown didn't start with garages. One-car garages were added. Two-store garages were added. People added dormers later. People tore the second floor off and first the roof off and went up to. So if you went to Levittown now, you see diversity. When it was first built, you didn't. You're trying to create that diversity that you see 40, 50 years after the original development. But you can build that into an architectural standard so that you give that architect and that landscape architect some guidance to the housing styles that are acceptable to you as residents within the community.
And it's not just housing styles, as we have said. It's the lot itself, how it relates, as you said, to the other lots in an area, whether it's a larger scale subdivision of sorts or, again, looking at bigger picture. And can you explain, you said something about the $35,000. Does that mean that's money that's already been committed to Horsley Witten? Or?
We have just under $100,000 in the Horsley Witten contract, and I think we've expended about 65 to 70.
This is not South Kingstown. There's too many.
I did mention Plum Beach on Nantucket.
Uh-huh.
So that's Plum Beach on Nantucket.
So it's not South Kingstown.
Or that
No,
density.
it isn't.
It's not South Kingstown, but it's a laid out community that there is thought into the interrelationship between the houses, the outbuildings, the road, the streets, and the alleys. It wasn't just done one house and then we'll leave it up to the next person to figure out where that next house goes.
But what strikes me with this is how wide the streets are. And I've said this before, I'm a big fan of the Strong Towns website. And they talk about how, fire departments are driving the size of streets when it's very possible for a fire department to buy smaller equipment for their in-town fire stations. And I realize we have no control over Union Fire District, but I feel like it's a little bit of a boys' club with the biggest toys, and let's get the biggest fire truck we can get. And there is fire equipment that will fit down a narrow street. You've just got to get the fire department to think about buying it and saying, okay, for the Peacedale Fire Station, we're going to have these smaller trucks, and they're going to get there first and start putting water on, and then the bigger trucks, the pumpers will come in. And I just think, these huge streets that don't, there are smaller streets in town. Somehow they've managed to get down those streets over the years until the trucks got too big.
And the trucks do operate in reverse. And we have had this conversation in the past with the fire department, going back a little while, and there was no problem. All of a sudden they have, I don't know, if they come to TRC and think that they dictate the street design, that's not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And again, I only showed this example not as a style of architecture for South Kingstown, because this is very different than what you have kind of in Peacedale and everything. But it's how an architectural and landscape team sits at the table and looks at every component of a development. So that when you're in, these houses are in close proximity, but no one is doing the dishes waving at their neighbor
Right.
window to window.
But Matunic,
back
these
a slide.
would be perfect in Matunic or Green Hill.
See the little, right next to the tennis court, there's a little building that's probably an equipment building, and then the one to the left of that, I'm thinking that's more in terms of size what we're talking about, not these giant.
Yeah, or the
These are,
second
I'm
one in
assuming
on
these
the
are
left,
single.
Maria.
Are these single family or are these condos? Oh, yeah. So the smaller one, not the tool shed. No, that one too, but yes, that one. That's got kind of some add-ons, but
But again, that's the interrelationship with a good design team laying out the whole thing versus here's a lot of the house, here's a lot of the house.
Right, but it looks like, right, yes, yes, exactly.
And
Right.
we don't have that opportunity. We don't have that kind of space to plan such a large development.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
Well, I think it's the theory behind it that Jamie's referring to,
Or
even on a smaller
It
scale.
could just be
Do we-
4 units in infill, but what you typically get if it was 4 units in infill is 4 rectangular lots.
Right.
Because your zoning code has setbacks for each
And a
lot.
cul-de-sac and a big wide street.
But we do have FDRP, which certainly could
But you
be,
don't have the design standards.
right, exactly, so you need the FDRP.
So you get the lot lines, you don't get the design. So it's integrating some of the tools you already have into those design components, if that's what you want as a planning board.
And then just, this is from a planning publication. It's called The Secrets of Successful Communities, and there are 7 points that I think we all need to kind of keep in mind. Have a vision for the future, inventory community assets like we've talked about with looking at mapping and what we have. Use education and incentives, not just regulation. Pick and choose among development projects. Cooperate with neighbors for mutual benefit. Pay attention to community aesthetics. Have strong leaders and committed citizens. Kind of summarizes it for me anyway.
Jamie, would this draft regulation, would you be adding language to this about the sort of the landscaping and architectural plan, the pre-application? Would that be part of this? And I think also the concept of fitting into the overall feel and scheme of the neighborhood. I mean, we talk about materials and we've got some examples of designs. So would you be adding to this, or would that be somewhere else? Or?
So what you have before you is the basic framework. It's the dimensional requirements. With regards to the language and criteria, we would do something similar to what we did on the village regs, where there's a bulletin and there's a 4 or 5 page design guideline.
Okay.
For mansion houses, there's a 4 or 5 page design guidelines for the townhouses. But if you don't like townhouses, if you don't like the mansion houses, if you don't like those, there's no sense at this time to move forward with the designs of those. I was actually in an area of Massachusetts this past weekend, and this wonderful building that's up onto my radar. That could be multifamily housing.
Is it a hotel?
It's actually a hotel. So, but that type of integration and architectural and foresight fits in a lot of areas.
It's beautiful. I don't know how realistic it is these days to build stone unless that was an existing building. It looks like there's a barn behind. I mean, it's very cool.
Yeah.
But I just think that this is not setting the right tone.
In what way?
It's not village scale. I don't believe that 12 units should be considered a minor subdivision unless we have some real standards in place. And as I said before, our current regulations need some modification so that we have flexibility and authority to have a better design and better outcome, and not just look at the density, but look at the lots or the combination of lots as a whole, because there are so many other considerations.
Are we going to look at this item by item, or are we
No.
just talking in general?
General.
In general, I think that in terms of conversions, that the neighbor needs some protection. If you've bought a house next to another house and suddenly it's going to turn into an apartment building, you need some protection against that. That's item, 5 here under B. Where does that leave our neighbors, all of a sudden there's a parking lot with people blasting music out of their car when they come home at 2 o'clock in the evening or morning. Right? That can be a nightmare for...
Well, yeah, I think that one of the things that's confusing to folks is even just the inclusionary zoning provisions that we have and the comprehensive permits whereby you might have surrounding areas that are all half-acre, one-acre lots, and then a comp permit comes in and you have, 2 acres or larger, and you have this greater density, and of course they have purchased their homes and lived all these years in this area without necessarily the assumption that because something is not developed that it won't be, but that the area that they have purchased their home in is zoned R40 or what have you. And the inclusionary zoning and certainly the comprehensive permit does change the zoning in those areas. So I think it's a surprise for many people to find, well, I have one house on this lot and now, next door to my lot, it's 4 houses or whatever. So that's why I mentioned that part about working with the community and education and thinking about how this changes our overall zoning. Looking at the build-out. I don't recall seeing any kind of a build-out study for many, many years that South Kingstown has done. And I think that would be very helpful.
Can we also discuss the idea of having to have sewer and town water? What's the purpose behind insisting on that? Because the first thing that would come to my mind is it's a high-density development you're talking about, so there's a lot of water use that's going to go on there. And then it's all going out to the bay instead of recharging. I don't see that as good planning.
Commonly, when you see greater density, particularly in urbanized areas, that greater density occurs where you have public water and sewer because that's related to capacity, as opposed to.
But you're
areas
losing
that
your
are on
water.
wells. You are.
So why do we insist that it have to be hooked up? Wouldn't it be better if we can put the water back in the ground?
Amy, you wanted?
There is something to be said when you pull water from a particular watershed and it goes back into that watershed. But it's also difficulty at the densities you're discussing and contemplating as infill to site on-site well and on-site on-site wells and septic with separating distances required by the health code. And then provide the parking lot and provide stormwater renovation and the building footprint. So in most instances, when you're looking at these more urbanistic type developments with regards to infill, there is a mandate on sewer and water. Again, you have a water treatment plant, you have a water distribution system in the town, and it's contemplated that there is a water draw from one drainage basin and there is a discharge to a different drainage basin, and it's contemplated with that. In our discussions with public service and some of the water issues in town, I believe it's my understanding that there's not a water draw issue. There's capacity in the ground in the well system. There's just a distribution issue and a storage issue. They can't store enough water to distribute when it's needed in the summer months. So it's not a capacity issue of the ability to get the water out of the ground. It's in the distribution and storage system. No.
Yeah, well, if I could just have a second, I would add to that there's been a dramatic change in septic system technology over the last 30 years that I personally have witnessed when I started working for DEM in '91 under the old ancient septic system leaching system formats, and now it's it's completely different. I used to joke with people back when we started experimenting with advanced treatment systems that we should go around buying up all the lots that were previously undevelopable because they were going to become developable, and sure enough, they have. So we have the capacity to put septic systems on properties now that we didn't 30 years ago. And if you can do that in a situation where you don't have to intermingle septic systems with wells, it does become more doable. So if you have public water, you might be able to put septic systems in some locations that you couldn't have previously. So there may be something there to look at.
I would just add the other issue with those advanced systems is that they do require more maintenance and upkeep than, they're expensive to install, and then they do require, annual or every 2 years. They need work. They have pumps and filters, and they're complicated. And
once your water's gone, it's gone. You don't get drinkable water back.
yeah, I mean, if this were Arizona, I'd be more concerned about it. I mean, I think what Jamie said about not having the storage capacity in the water towers to deliver enough water in the summertime is why we have watering bans and.
Because we're still low density.
I think the water. I mean, I'm less concerned about losing the groundwater and putting it back in the ground with the septic system. Even with advanced systems, there is still a pollutant load going into the ground that could be better handled by.
Yeah, but it doesn't get back in the ground. It goes out to the bay.
I know.
The other thing, Jamie, I wanted to ask is when we had our work session, and Horsley Witten was in attendance, and we brought up the idea of Old Tower Hill Road and the fact that doing a rezone of that area might solve multiple problems in addition to adding significant affordable housing, particularly as it relates to the study that Will Green's class did. And they said, well, that's not in our contract. Well, if there's money left over and we would like to see something for that area, don't we have that inherent flexibility?
There is that possibility.
Okay.
And again, that's why, a lot of people the study's taking long, but I think you're doing this methodically with a lot of foresight, and it allows you to potentially have that flexibility and switch gears a little bit in your focus, and potentially add Tower Hill, maybe be a little more heavier on the architectural standards and less on the written words versus the pictorial. And I put this slide up just because, Paul, this talks to your point. There are 9 versions of housing styles within that Plum Island development. So, and again, they're all integrated into each other in this jigsaw puzzle. But if you had design guidelines, and again, this is representative of Nantucket, but if your design guideline had those 9 styles of houses, and when the architect and landscape architect came in, they looked at a code, they looked at what you're trying to emulate, they could do slight variations of those, but you'd be directing the style of development you're looking for a little more clearly than make it look like things in South Kingstown. Because some people see different things in South Kingstown.
And as, as stated earlier, the landscaping needs to be integrated, not be the proverbial parsley around the pig, so that it actually, no, that's a real expression, so that it's part of the plan as a whole.
Yeah, and coming back to that landscaping, and I can't remember if I said this during a meeting or afterwards, but I was thinking about McDonald's on Old Tower. It has very nice landscaping. And then we saw there's Burger King next door. It's going to have its own landscaping plan. And it occurred to me that some consistency of landscaping along the roadway would really reduce the sort of visual pollution, make it a much more attractive. If both of those businesses shared or had some consistent landscaping, it becomes a longer, unbroken stretch. I think it would look much nicer rather than saying, well, we've got our landscaping plan and they've got theirs. And it's just broken. visually it's broken, and just sort of stretching it out, and I think it would be much more appealing.
Right, piecemeal rather than a corridor plan as a whole.
It's parsley around the pig for one and rosemary around the other pig,
So are we talking about a landscape architect that works for the town and looks at any development, or do the
Well,
developers?
we're talking about two things. We're talking about, one, significantly updating our landscape regulations because they're in great need of, but also we're talking about requiring a project to have a landscape architect and an architect working hand in hand.
Right, but my question is that a person that does South Kingstown all the time, or is that?
No, I was just thinking that,
The
again, with
developer
Someone who's,
does.
yeah.
Yeah.
the same idea with
Because I think you get a lot of continuity and understanding when the landscaper knows intimately our
You have had landscapers integrated into the community, and you see the results.
Which is why we need
I didn't know that.
need
Okay.
them to be well
And it's not
clear and
It's not a criticism of the individual who have worked in town. They're being hired to meet a standard. So I think part of your role as a planning board is articulate the vision,
yeah.
set the standard in the code, and then hold them to that standard. But suggest, from a regulatory standpoint, that the applicants start with the appropriate trained, educated individuals.
I think
So you don't get a landscaper, you get a landscape architect. You don't get a house designer, you get an architect.
But I think, again, just as with the structural architecture, the landscape architecture should look at the existing context and say, where can we improve on what's already here rather than do something different just because it's a different lot and it's a different business. And, and I suppose from a business standpoint, there's probably some pushback on that, well, we want to look different. We don't want people to confuse us with the business next door. I don't know if people think that way or not, but I can imagine someone coming in and saying, we have this standard design that we use because that's how people recognize us,
Well, when we first developed our design manual and the whole FDRP process, one of the ideas behind it, the principles, was that an applicant looks at a site and looks at what is there and what the benefits are of the site and the topography and the existing vegetation, rather than the two-dimensional, let's cut it all down.
Clear everything and do
Right,
something
and
new.
then-
Yeah.
So a typical development process, in my experience, in 3 states, is the developer calls his engineer or his surveyor, tells him he's interested in the parcel or he's purchased it. He has an old survey. Can you look at the zoning code and tell me how many lots I can get? You're trying to change that dynamic. We're in South Kingstown now. They have standards and regulations. It's not just about how many lots I can get, it's how many lots I can get that meet the code. And here's the standards associated with the code. And the regs say first thing I should do is not call my engineer, it's call my landscape architect, my engineer, and my architect, put them all in the room together,
Exactly.
and then design a development that, as a board representing the community, you've tried to articulate a style of development.
It needs to be a team approach, and I think, as Jamie said, too often it's let's do the engineering, and then the landscape architecture and the architecture is kind of relegated to the background.
And depending on who you talk to first, the engineers say their process is better because if the architect and landscape architect do it, they're not considering stormwater drainage. That little parabola they showed that said detention basin isn't big enough, doesn't work. But the skill sets are getting better, the training's getting better, and the schooling's getting better, and everyone's seeing improved products out there.
And I imagine Brian, from his experience at URI, can say that landscape architects these days are very aware of stormwater management and how it relates to a plan.
Yeah, that's right.
Green
Education has evolved.
Yes, absolutely. All right, well, if everybody is said what they would like to say, let's move on to our next agenda item, which is Planning Board Liaison Activities. Joe, do you have anything?
I was Brian a little before this because these affordable housing meetings seem to all blend in together. But the last one we had discussed mostly just reiterated and gone over what they heard from Horsley Witten. So that was a big part of it. We talked a little more about education and public outreach. I don't think there was anything very significant other than going over I think it was mostly internal for their own education, I think the discussions were.
I would agree with that. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about their attendance at your meeting and learning a lot from about the considerations going into the multi-unit discussion. But the other thing is that they've been continuing to work on some public education and outreach, how best to go about doing that. Is it in person? Is it online? Is it Zoom? Is it Facebook? And I think that's slowly the conclusion that they're coming to, that it has to be a little bit of everything.
Let me just throw this out. Earlier in this meeting tonight, we talked about, a lot of it was driven by Paul's conversation, the comprehensive permit versus our inclusionary zoning, and having some type of incentives or maybe changing our inclusionary zoning a little so that is the tool of choice versus the comprehensive permit, and that maybe there's some opportunity for additional housing or different size housing. Is that something maybe we should give to the affordable, to just come up with some ideas on how the inclusionary zoning can be one of choice? And maybe, and what I'm thinking is maybe if they meet with some of the builders and say, what would make you, obviously these are the goals of the town, but what would make you want to do this over that? Where are your hardships? Where can we give you flexibility that's a win-win? And maybe just come up with have them brainstorm some ideas and give it back to this committee.
And, the other thing, Joe, is that Charlestown recently completed a project that was done with multiple partners, nonprofits. It was church housing and a couple of other partners, and looking at ways to better put those partnerships together so that you have projects that are actually 100% affordable. It's a very well done project, so it's definitely worth having a look at, and I think researching how they did it, how they put all those partners together, because I think that is something that would do very well, that kind of a project.
So maybe the thoughts that they come up and present back would not only be incentives, but also process. So
Yes.
What type of processes could we...
Right, look at Charles,
inclusion,
how they did it.
Bring other folks,
Yeah.
mandatory pre-application review with different groups and
Yeah,
incentives.
not just the regulations, but how to bring groups together, and especially like Habitat.
process.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, I think you have a unique opportunity as a board, based on your discussion tonight with regards to your open-mindedness associated with having a slightly larger market rate in a community with a slightly smaller LMI. That type of flexibility may be something that is very attractive to a developer. The development process potentially has a little more certainty than the comprehensive permit. It's not necessarily adversarial. It's done hand in hand with guidelines and design standards, but it doesn't mean that his market rate house has to carry the full load of a similar sized LMI. Maybe it is you look at a double wing colonial, maybe the market rate house, it only has one wing instead of a double wing. Maybe it only has a 1-car garage versus a 2-car garage. Maybe it doesn't have a garage. And that's the Levittown example, where not all the houses had garages, and some people who could afford it added them, and some people who couldn't didn't. But that means the developer doesn't have to put the whole burden on the market, which means in order to carry that, he needs more density. So maybe there is an opportunity here to be a little creative and look at that. And I'll see if we can, under our existing contract, have Union Studios do a few quick little, 20, 30,000 square foot lot type sketches of showing, can you show me a couple of, 25, 2,600 square foot houses and a couple 12s, 14s, 16s, and show me how they look and how we can integrate them. So when you drive into the neighborhood, you don't go market rate LMI, market rate LMI. You really don't know because there's slightly different variations from them.
You talked a while back, you used I think the term was big house, little house, back house, barn, or something like that. So the idea of a large market rate home with a small rental unit attached.
Correct.
So I buy this house and I've got this LMI unit. The whole thing's affordable to me and I'm going to rent out this thing. Smaller. It's with the right architecture, it could look wonderful and add to that LMI stock.
Correct.
I think we have to be somewhat careful of that. As a matter of fact, we had a comprehensive permit project that we kind of turned that part down. Right, we approved the project,
Right.
but we made that condition of approval, and we just got to be cognizant that for the LMI housing, there's a need for all types of rentals.
Right.
1, 2, 3, or 4 bedroom, and how do we get those?
Exactly.
And some of that is making them compatible to the market rate.
To have the mix.
Hopefully you get that diversity.
Yes, you're referencing something, a project whereby the applicant tried to get around the equity issue and tried to make all the LMI units, accessory dwelling units.
Up near URI, yeah.
And Joe, to your point, I think what you're discussing, if it's just a 20,000 square foot lot and you're trying to do 4 units and you're trying to do this unique integrated community of big house, front house, back, it gets harder. But if you have someone who's looking at 3 or 4 acres and all of a sudden you could, my regulatory brain, it keeps spinning it, you could build this hierarchy where the developer under an LMI is allowed to do X number of market rate at a certain size. He's allowed to have, say there's 10 units and 3 of them have to be incentive. Maybe one can be 20% smaller than his market rate, one can be 30% smaller than his market rate, and one can be an ADU that's only 800 square feet. And you let him build that integration into it. But I think what we've seen in zoning has done this over time. And if you go to the bigger developments, even if you look at things in Massapequa on Long Island or Levittown, you put things in boxes. And you look at Pine Hills, which is a big development in Plymouth, Massachusetts. There's a cottage development, but it's only a cottage development, and there's 60 of them. And then you go to the next little enclave, and that's all little single-family houses. But there's no integration of the 2 different model types. And I think what you're talking is a little bit outside the box of trying to integrate the different housing types within a development and have a mix of LMI and market rate outside of the comprehensive permit process, which mandates the developer do like, kind, and quality on the exterior.
So, Maria, if you're agreeable, and if the board's agreeable, that maybe we ask the Affordable Housing Commission to come back with ideas and the inclusionary, I'm not sure how we would go about that. Is that something that maybe have Brian write up a draft from you to the board, and then we can review that next time, or is that?
I think it's worth them having the conversation about ways to better integrate the units within a project, and as well as, again, going back to the actual mechanism of how to put some of these, I'm sure that there have been many conversations about the ideal of having projects that are 100% affordable, and having them really go and study that Charlestown project and figuring out how they did it. I'm sure the folks in the planning department would be happy to chat with them. I know that I think Don Powers was involved in the design.
I'm just wondering do we just, obviously Brian's here. And
Yeah,
I'm here.
I don't think we need
Brian
anything
just thought
formal.
You don't think
Yeah.
we'd have that.
Well, I can certainly put some notes together or a bulleted list, and the 3 of us could have a discussion on how to maybe and Joe's familiar with the way some of our discussions wander in the affordable housing committee meetings. So I would like to have something that really gives them some specific direction, things to think on.
Okay.
And I've written down a number of different things that we've talked about, and I'll try and put something together and
Sure.
run it by you guys.
Yeah, that sounds good. I do want to add something to the liaison activities with regard to the General Assembly and the bills that were passed. Multiple bills, all under the umbrella of affordable housing, but some of them weren't quite. For example, there was a quorum bill that changed how quorums are considered. There's an accessory dwelling unit bill. There are bills that relate to the comprehensive permits that reduce our timeframes for decision.
Back up to the form bill. What do you mean by
The what?
you said something about forms?
A quorum. Quorum. Now a quorum can be a
Time for hearing
majority of
aids.
members. So if you have 3 people out of a 7-person board show up for a meeting, which we rarely have that issue, but 2 people could make a decision to approve or deny. So some of those weren't really affordable housing bills, and I know that Brian has started to compile a list. I know that statewide planning, and I imagine Mike's office, Andy, probably is in the process of trying to define what those are going to need, because we're going to need to make some changes to our subdivision regs and our zoning ordinance with regard to some of those required changes. The provision for a fee in lieu has been modified, but not the calculation for determining the amount per lot, which is unfortunate. So there are quite a few there are quite a few changes that will affect all communities. So we need to be aware of those, and especially the accessory dwelling unit in particular is one that has been of great concern amongst the planning community, and of course we have a very specialized one that allows for that tax credit, which is, I think, unique to South Kingstown. So it's important that state legislation doesn't undo some of the good things that we have in our regulations, and that we still have the ability to make decisions about what's best for our community and that whole self-governance. So there's a lot of concerns with regard to that.
Would it be inappropriate to talk about what I was talking about before the meeting about ADUs, or is that, I don't know if it's something that needs to be on an agenda or not?
Well, we will, again, probably from Mike's office, have a debrief on what that's going to mean for our ADUs and whether or not we have any flexibility.
When can I move in?
Where are those, Jamie?
Sign me up.
Are those also?
Those are built and they're down south, but this is a firm of Allison Ramsey. It's not the name of a individual. It is Mr. Allison and Mr. Ramsey. They did a lot of work that came out of the Katrina devastation in Louisiana.
Very nice.
But what's unique about their website, and I put this up so that if any of the planning board members are interested, we'll go back to that website. If you go to their website and they have house plans, and you're literally, all of them are well designed from an internal and external standpoint, and you can start punching in square footages. So they'll do everything from 600 square feet to 4,000 square feet. But it's not like going to a house designer. These are all architecturally designed. But Paul, to your point, beautiful community. But if you did a comprehensive permit, you couldn't add something bigger or smaller to this mix. So I think what it is you use someone like, and Don Powers, Allison and Ramsey are big members of the Congress of New Urbanism as well as Union Studios. But the ability for them to integrate the different styles with this type of architecture so they all work together.
The street trees look a little peaked, but you can tell that it's in the south. Interesting that they don't have the metal seamed roofs, which are so commonly seen. But yeah, nice designs.
This goes back to my question about setbacks. Is there any place in Wakefield, Peacedale, where you could build houses that close to the street under current zoning?
Only under our cottage regulations.
And for commercial, under commercial downtown.
But just walking down High Street, you have some units that aren't quite as close as this,
But many.
but they're 20 to 30 feet back with that front porch. So I think what you've talked about, we can get you to a point that you may be marginally comfortable to move the discussion forward.
Yes. The other thing, I just want to pass this around. The URI and DOT and DEM are doing this LID site planning and design techniques. It's a self-assessment. It is no cost for a community. These are copies that people can keep. They have already done this in, I think, 3 other communities, Richmond, Hopkinton, I think it's on one of these, West Greenwich, and they're looking to do it in South Kingstown. It would be nice if we had perhaps these folks come and speak with us. That's the, these are, you can keep those. And this is sort of the fact sheet about what it is, and if you guys want. But since we deal with stormwater on a regular basis, and this might give us more tools to better manage stormwater, I think it's definitely worth having a conversation.
Maria, I started to look at that form, and I'm guessing it as you go through, and that form showing you end up with some sort of a score at the end. It's calculating as you.
Yes, and it also sends you when you go to that. It's strange to look at it on a hard copy, but it sends you to the area that the topic. You'll see what Joe's looking at right now. It's easier to look at that particular part online, but anyway, something that I think might be of use to us. That's all I have. Planning?
I have not, due to the hour, and
Yes.
council has been patiently waiting to get to
Yes.
item E. I will mention that under item E, there's a second subject, number 2, planning board roles and responsibilities. And given that you only have 4 of the 6 members tonight, it'd be my recommendation to table that this evening to a further
Certainly.
work session.
Certainly. And now 7, the council appointed a new member last
Oh,
night.
did, okay,
Yes.
okay.
So, Mike, you've got the floor. We're all ready to hear about this recreational cannabis and what we're going to have to do.
So planning boards throughout the state are dealing with the same exact subject. And I don't mean dealing in a pejorative manner. It's a positive thing. The council elected to send this to the voters in a referendum in November to decide whether or not recreational marijuana will be allowed in the town. My guess and the council's guess is that, knowing South Kingstown, it will be approved. The thought is then, well before that kicks in after the November 8th election, we want to have the zoning in place to control this, because we certainly don't want these activities going on in residential areas, et cetera. Our simple advice here, that there are actually 4 areas it applies to: manufacturing, cultivation, lab testing, and retail. But our advice is, we already have some pretty extensive regs set up for medicinal marijuana, the Compassion Center, et cetera. Those are allowed in the commercial highway and the industrial 1 zone. What we're looking for in my office is just a little feedback from you before we draft. We're prepared to draft the ordinance. We'll do it in a thorough manner. We just need some feedback from you as to whether or not you agree that that's where we should locate recreational sales, manufacture, cultivation, meaning industrial and commercial highway, or if you feel differently, if you think there's another zone. And by the way, this will all be by special use permit.
Well, we certainly learned a lot just doing development plan review of the medicinal facilities. Although they were within close proximity to one another, they were all a little different, and some were better suited, at least for the smaller scale medicinal use, than others. I know that one of the things that came to the forefront on a regular basis was the issue of traffic and parking. And I imagine that once we're considering recreational use, that would definitely be.
Yeah, retail, there'll be retail stores where you can go in and buy this stuff.
Right.
I'll never understand it, but anyhow.
Right.
Are the, I'm thinking commercial highway, would the siting for one of these facilities be similar to a liquor store?
Yeah, could
And
very well be.
I've always wondered, could a liquor store say, I'd like to offer I'd like to have a counter, where I'm also offering this along with my Jack Daniels and.
Well, that's why we need zoning in place first.
Where is, in terms of the state rules and regulations related to this and enforcement and all those things that go along with it that other states have had to manage, how do we develop a set of regulations without necessarily having the knowledge of how the state is going to do all of this in terms of enforcement and whatever, their DBR and whatever they're going to be?
Obviously, there are a lot of blanks right now, but the legislation itself is pretty specific. It gets down to things like you can't prohibit the operation of a facility within 500 feet of a school, for instance. We have a $1,000 limit for the medicinal one. Now, that didn't impact medicinal, but my point is, we, at least initially, will work off the legislation. We will certainly work into the ordinance everything that's allowed by the legislation, and we'll go from there. Like anything else, it may have to be tinkered with. I think the critical thing for right now is to limit where these activities are going to take place. And I'm not sure, Maria, and the rest of you, whether or not between now and November, DBR, I doubt it, that they're going to have all these lovely regs in place. I just don't know. And enforcement, frankly, just going not off record, but off topic a little bit, enforcement is going to be a nightmare. The Police Chiefs Association was 100% against it, 100%. And as we sit here today, they don't know, I don't know as a prosecutor, how we are going to deal with stoned individuals. There's no test, and marijuana stays in your system for days and maybe weeks. So it's not a question of, within the last hour you had 5 beers, or there's no, it's going to be very tough. Very, very tough.
Well, it looks as though, this is going to be on our work sessions between now and November, if that's the deadline for the referendum.
We want to get, though, what's critical is that we want to get you for your next work session next month in August, a proposed ordinance for you to actually look at.
Yes.
Because we need to give time, obviously, for the council to adopt the actual amendment. We want all that done before November 8th. So we're on a tight timeline. I'm prepared, my office is prepared to give you an ordinance. We just thought we'd begin tonight by saying, here's what we had in mind, and if that's okay as a starting point, let us go ahead and do it. Then we can put something in front of you so you have it to look at and read, and we can certainly go from there. Nothing's etched in stone. I just wanted to be sure. The main issue is, does it make sense to limit recreational activities in the same places that we've limited medicinal activities?
And there may be some issues with our limited commercial highway areas as well. So, the industrial areas may be a better fit when we're talking about this larger scale.
I agree. When we're talking about cultivation and manufacturing, the smells from manufacturing.
Exactly, yep.
We definitely only want that in industrial.
Yes.
I think, in my mind at least, the lab testing and the retail sales would fit in the commercial highway.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can answer this, but do the police chiefs think that there would be a large increase in cannabis use because now it's legal? I mean,
probably not.
I kind of feel like the people that are,
probably people are using it, are going to continue to use it without penalty now. Clearly, there will be some, I think,
increase.
people who have been not using it because it was quote-unquote illegal probably will try it. But, who the heck knows?
And I would imagine things like, it's you can't really drink, you can't walk down Main Street with a beer in your hand.
No, but you can walk down Main Street and gobble
Edibles, right.
Yeah, exactly.
A few years ago, Joe, you may remember this, we had someone from the AG's office come and talk about kind of regulatory issues and some of the problems that they have encountered with
Madam Chair, the
legal
examples, Rhode Island just adopted the legal use of recreational marijuana or cannabis. Massachusetts did it roughly 2 years ago where it was legalized. So there are the examples in Massachusetts, Connecticut. 169 municipalities in Connecticut are scrambling the right regulations as their recreational cannabis regulations come online. And most of them are dealing with the same things you are. Which areas in town are appropriate? Adopting ordinances associated with the outdoor use of the product, similar to open container laws, public, and some are saying public places as well as public spaces. So public places are sidewalks, parks, and municipal buildings. Public places can be considered restaurants and other places of gathering. So you have to be crafty in how you adopt these. If your intent is you don't want restaurants to allow the consumption outdoors, similar to a cigarette, you need to potentially explore that on the regulatory side.
We'll include that, by the way. It's a good point. I didn't even touch upon the issue of, I think clearly, in fact, the council even said this, we don't want it in our open spaces, for sure. So when you go to a ball game, you're not going to be there next to someone smoking weed.
But if you're at an outdoor restaurant, is it allowed or not allowed?
No, personally, I'd treat it like smoking and say no.
I was just thinking about cigar bars, though. It's in a whole new market for the cigar bar.
Yeah. But again, some of the models exist out there. The biggest things are what Maria touched upon is traffic and parking. Can the facilities park their intended customer base, and how does that customer base and parking affect traffic?
Yes. One of the plans we reviewed had so little parking that between that and COVID, they had plans for having people standing outside in the parking lot adjacent to another retail facility, which, yeah. And we can certainly learn from anyone else who's gone through the process.
Sure, and as part of that special use permit process, those issues, the traffic, the parking, et cetera, would of course all come into play.
Yeah.
But I'll put something together and we'll get it to you, and hopefully for your next work session, you'll have something to
Great.
look at.
Okay. Thank you. Would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
This was cozy.